The one I see has been sent. Let me know when everyone gets it.
Yeah, I just got it.
All right, so Archbishop Mitty has it and the judge has it. We're good. Okay. Mass incarceration is a teleological arrangement of time and space that constructs a fluid criminality to ensure the dispossession of indigenous people, i.e. through the criminalization of the ghost dance movements and subsequent legalization of genocide. Linear narratives obscure dispossession as the Emancipation Proclamation constructs a chronology of progress the same week of the Dakota death penalty. Native Americans understand this temporal coinciding as a remaking of history into past, present, future, creating temporal ricks for the colonial order as each movement builds on a superposition to pan-indigenous resistance. S17. The ghost dance is the end of the present end of the world or web the use of the term the return as the people dance suddenly their dad is the year when the were not see this world war there's rather felt remembered experience than any colonial future that could be read instead of reservation that story is based on the ghost dance book had related to the character that the local as Milton real new book he tells the army brother with the proud inspired movements Neil and fought occupation the Great Lake to as God wanted to come say who are fight U.S. occupation in Ohio age true upon an accumulation of historical brains debate our pessimism sort of divide Milton could agreement on to secure the U.S. into the life was punishable by imprisonment negotiations inherently challenged the colonial order boarding school student used to mess with others means of the meditation goes to widespread the military right to the mood and state bull shut up the head goes to the wood and knee the victory massacre 300 Dakotas counter scored by middle of state wars 70 the not more than 2 secret and Dakota access pipeline police he determined Adams over the year and secret romans and other total friends who killed in the YouTube order the day exactly 100 years before Apple the same make the league inside the message market the distance of 38 Dakota the campaign that hold we can go to red ribbon through even listen so we able to our history the future how can do sustain his life people through the horse that are memories of the visions and acting it. Settler states operationalize linearity through a colonial time that mediates smooth transitions and distinctions between past, present, and future through move towards stability that shut out resistance imaginaries for those who internalize linear time. However, colonial time is infinitely co-constituted by tensions as Lakota and prisoners of war live time differently. Akbari Bavar 17. Time which governing powers that him to conduct the message in the future by opposing to borders and go get other attention. Comrade time and relations that states revenue and moves of an organization iron set into contact time the reason the rumors of reals that had to believe in contact time that legal broadcast the blade and even the controls of people yet came to challenge the ribbon of police could not have a single technique in prison like cut out on time that is such a weird individual with the other clock task and set policies and orderly control welfare required for 3 years a week the Lakota revised the regular by prison when it's either on entire in prison or members are and they got a temporal battery bearing the time the clone times out of the time definitely while living die with the stage line to relate to the good have to the chronology. The affirmative exposes the tensions within prison regimes that attempt to impose colonial time through a reading of narratives of those who are imprisoned by the state. Time is a fluid imaginary for Iranian prisoners of war whose memories of torture become ghostly entanglements that infinitely haunt their present future. Constraining violence to a past event absolves our responsibility to the present, but the absent temporal break situates ourselves within all temporalities of violence at once. This is not a disavowal of clock time, but rather a revisiting the past that rejects universalizing chronological distinctions. Akbar UBR 17. Then go to time to live on letter early not reconfiguring temporality spatial linear lens that are narrative shape like pity our end operation on time by asexual limiting the pass through prison burden the control path in the future and torture used to colonize the voting meditating with limitation around sensitivity as neglected ignored violence on public and private attention. Attention, Chanticators, unseen breath and collective memory, the already gone to the imagination, and memoirs prisoners when written red or sure lot with the temporal linearity, with the rest of the future to be sheltered, betting how to become also move toward the fluid of imaginary which is like grounded, collect on the water, and the world linearity, cannot do justice to the moon, only from hazard, or better hazard, to be the best, not theologically. There's a recipe in chapel included from the history ahead of the 10 that we can directly, we think discourses matter in our nature, we can make the more world through which batteries are never and actually they're not in regret, but hope it was another future could have reasonable stations, non-modernity, this the negative batteries, social passion, reality when we share a list of narratives, we become time travel, numerous shades of everything evokes results, but it was the masters and futures. Right, I could live in a different world of praise, we're better living towards time than it is how it is matter on a quarter being taken over the wilderness, more than the world, and medical going to time and preserve visitors back to the future, and be separated. Never our trouble breaks up our call to time, especially with a lie out of position, nothing can remain the past brain until anger states space is lost, meeting the only way out of being open letter for the revising the from the future by any content imagination had to be fluid. We don't mean travel in time, no imagine no past, no memory, the measurement started of forgetting all these separate in the present. If you don't let it have we hit our response, we're going to take all that I'm going to be interrogating the little time, share narrative, and title part of our editing process, the president of imagination, moving on, or moving government to the past. Narrative remembering is simply not non-linear but quantum, undoing notions of scale and separability. Time is blown to bits by colonialism and the atom bomb, and space-time matter now constitutes itself through abundant interactions of the relationality between CGR, nuclearity, and infinity. Barrel 17. It is between the clock humanity and the clock the magnetic nuclear session. What is perfect? 1530 says I have 246 time not turn papers between the breeze. Each one of the motor the body clock he having the Bob Road to their homes, their features, and radiation, but he back to bodies of reduced the yard from measuring elements, radioactivity, designated bombing demand, and our world, a lot of unintentional, but I'm for them to have the present again, most of the worthy of the wind that travel and decided to let these are in every living history, memory, a little future of the real, and the resurrection, I don't know the road to the man, not the brush, into a letter for news, by the Mitty stand for them, I'll be doing that atomic makes it over the line, I'll go to the line with the macro and also when our book about it is preordained, and your negative radio take no scale must have long been a bonus, but the name matter will be another than as Russian no scale, which allows them to string from quantum to nuclear from macro to backward scale. They did really interactively reconfigure body become back to the river. He because I had an just reactive as the river body molecule battery who can't the conquerors universality of space time matter near and this UFT is every bit of matter every moment time the trip you got to use space time matter just at a second but that dynamics of quantum physics provides to run the matter the matter of new theory and the bomb against each other and as the duty that really matters always around you cut from nothing about space and time and the void and automatically separate different reading quantum physics. They're going to breathe out and look at understand their motor how things can exist or they're staying after they've run the scene and they come up with the inseparability of their acting agency dynamic beacon space time and relationalities. Quantum temporality acknowledges that matter and the void are not ontologically separate nor empty, but haunted by the presence of ghostly entanglements. Teleological understandings of predictable policy change render the void a nothingness that justifies conquest via terra nullis. Baron 18. Matter was QVT was responsible for the war, and another one to physicists that work on the new military technology. The skills rotated between military research and studies of the war with dignity with appear theoretical physics and problematic of the use of dichotomy continuity and discontinuity, sort of on a lot of the children theory, but we're into the fact that theorizing quantizing the animal and take over time and being or made already got remade that time is important exploding itself even but made a resistant almost and indeterminacy of the nature of being nature to one atoms that avoid doesn't matter about actually that much better namely matter which space and time are absolutely universal things. No but these kind of that have existed independently discrete but the substance can move matter from the forces that are external motion and filterability and there is a matter of motion where the movement is determined that woman's external forces to keep the void is not empty but matter is a kind of the intermediate dynamics of the nothingness of the void. Nothingness is not present, not exist. The void is oriented toward becoming, ghostly, not exist, the being and nothing, where every possible path has not experiment with the world with it. Whereas the initial questioning is what down identity is arbitrarily political for the void offer justification for outer the discovery of virgin charity, the notion that atoms of space are empty rather than putting the well-worn tool using colonials. Okay, open for cross.
Okay, are you good?
Yeah.
So I'm a little bit confused because it seems by the third card in the 1AC, your narratives are about Iranian prisoners of war. How does that relate to settlerism in the United States?
So Akbari makes the claim that Iran, who is not like a state that has enacted settler colonialism, but rather has become an authoritarian regime through imprisonment and through the sort of selective mediating of the past in like the post-war era, where they sort of rejected.
So why have you focused on Iranian prisoners of war?
Matter is inseparable from each other. States can become authoritarian, that states can become colonial, and that colonial time can be used as a tool for operationalization of genocide in other states. However, we probably reject the idea that our only narratives come from Iranian prisoners of war camps.
So would you argue that the same sentiment applies to other countries in the world?
The same card literally gives the example of how it is used against the Lakota as well, and has been used in like multiple examples.
Okay, so this argument is trying to establish like a global system of colonized time, for example, that exists because like just naturally authoritarian states as well as powerful elites in the United States have come to this on their own.
No, so this works off of Barad's thesis, which is what I was saying is this is like building on the idea that all matter is inseparable from each other. Barad is saying that emerged from both 1495 and 1945.
Okay, so I have a specific question about that. I'm confused then because the second card in the 1AC indicates that colonized time is directly from imposed policies, wage work, prison systems, etc. What does an analysis do to change those systems?
As an example of how the United States tried to colonize Lakota time, Estes builds on top of that by saying it also works through extra legal means, like the literal criminalization of ghost dancing, and not only through like the literal criminalization of the Dakota Massacre, but how like police and cops had heaped ceremonial items into piles and like
these all seem like very tangible things that have happened from government agencies. Like I'm confused what an analysis of narratives, although benign in intent, do to change any of those structures.
Indigenous ceremonial staffs and pissing on them is like a entirely material action that doesn't have anything to do with indigenous cosmology.
Okay, so would it be a good idea to punish the cops who did that?
Define punish?
Send them to jail.
The Dakotas did this through this ceremony where elders sort of danced around a fire and elders thread red ribbons through the ears of pennies to metaphorically like open Lincoln's ears.
Wait, that's not my question. I'm asking, you just said that cops messed with that and then somehow prosecuted the people who participated in that. Should the cops be punished for doing that?
So she just gave the example of how the Lakota have their own system of, I guess, I don't know if you want to call it punishment, but I guess.
Yeah, the indigenous people should do that, but the Supreme Court ensured it didn't happen by legalizing massacre, by making it a war.
They literally gave them medals of honor.
I'm setting the doc. It's going to be 4 off in case. Okay, it should be sent. Let me know when everyone has it. Okay, good. Evelyn, are you good too? Okay. The text of the resolution calls for debate on hypothetical government action. Erickson 3, each topic contains certain key elements. Agent doing the action of the United States, the verb should urges action, put a policy into action, the government needs to resolve. Regards the policy by law, words of phrase 64, resolves, express determination, resolution, opposed, resolved by the legislature, established by law, United States. Federal government means with 3 branches in DC, Chicago, manual noted. US official body to Congress, under US. Enact means established by legal act, right 13 act, finance established by legal authority, act, reform means changing policy, Project 11, reform delivered changing policy, those using well for making a very government for public, equitable. That means you can't win the act, negative team should not be burdened with rejoinder against untopical affirmative. The only impact your ballot has is where one that this debate was unfair from the start and skewed toward the affirmative vote, negative for competitive equity and clash filter your understanding of our model through debates. Competitive nature of being a game where board teams are here to win, which means it becomes meaningless without substantive consideration of fairness. The resolution serves as a predictable stasis point to enhance accessible research equitable ground, but obfuscating that limit makes negative preparation impossible because any ground received is self-serving concessionary and is affirmed is distorted literature basis. Defining a role for negation is essential. The same competition comes before any affirmative, often affirming issue with criminal justice is incredibly dogmatic now. Switching sides of a predictable stasis point solves better auto correct misunderstandings for her students for the real world of criminal justice. Rocco, no non-criminal justice body over active give couples unique controversy nature for diverse writing listing collaboration communications of matter of sexual criminal counter between my message taking criminal get the media after effective restriction all the bunch of electric as I really could groups of abilities to really change as whether active students discovery many stable black and white age black was popular as any students ever with their identity control comes to nature this regards to active this now the individuals on database of still very unique into research the criminal justice profession. Next up is the K that forecloses effective anti-capitalist policy apologies to bridging individuals to fantasies crucial to the collective future gene 12 reducing the education we computer different national policies we scapers we collective we said individual singularity so think that micropolitical activity that reaches self facial or in Russia or just which has a good difficulty building new way because we say thing in terms of harder so there just has to display political common with the absence of comical absolutely figure raising pieces of safe about like about concept goes through a new way and give couple numbers the rate is for the immediate as age of your journey on wheels struggle alternative is to orient politically and social struggle goes through the communist horizon of redirection is crucial redefine political future cycle analytically imaginable anything less is mere apologism for the continue left to failure gene 12 values horizon which designated way to make execution never lose even if we will just see their journal state barriers and our university companies who horizon over the most natural thing was obvious neither the free explanation for just future companies will continue to actuality of politics and this companies horizon as lost the companies horizon knowledge companies horizon companies perspective as we capitals no longer represent only game time the feel possibility of refugee theory get very action about the anything is possible taking the companies horizon interested to abolishing capitals we agree global situation country companies shift to stable job situation organization sovereignty of the people capitalism drive to accumulate compulsive environmental catastrophe unique warfare equality nothing to great as humans for the neck for emotional environment will likely to project struggles as getting armor conflict companies ever art advocacy be seeing tax about that capital accumulation must be stabilizing now go to eco disaster and with the essential rationality on the hospital ecological balance history to go over the environment catastrophe. Next up is the judiciary capital the United Federal Judiciary auto adopt reform in the imprisonment of prisoners of war and operation of genocide. Oh look, I forgot to put the politics this side in. Can you send on Discord? Case. Vote neg on presumption one process term using debate as a model of a mode of advocacy ensures the failure of the right of competition means debaters ally themselves with individuals who vote for them alienate those who are presented with the burden of rejoinder and forced to negate at worst you vote neg on presumption because they don't use debate as a stepping stone for the advocacy yes at this space and don't have a net benefit to affirming the 1AC second academia turn the 1AC is a regurgitation knowledge that already exists within academia that proves they aren't departure from status quo voting F is not intrinsic to affirming a new space time through competition turn competition ensures Nevada Union refines their method according to what best wins them ballots from judge not according to what best actually result balance for individuals outside of age ensures their method can't scale get co-opted by problematic norms in the debate community individual instances of deliberation can't self-subject to be number the rest of us cases deliberation we're not sure individual values are always perceived the latent way deliberation for the influence is about the positive provide is it means don't every cultural understanding emotional every understanding way increasing able to be willingness to do the complexity liberalism can be reported doesn't have problematic essence that is not impact purpose somebody seriously has to be as best possible they question third way that forms of good and evil so we go global across this view people fictional concepts not always determined by past use of original purpose a distinct way creative person may play different function different sort of liberals may not always function ideology same degree in they always will dominate locals the technical purpose but also we need to be careful to be extra my conscious another level of supposed to lazy way theoretical arms this right away so we can quickly to Western idea but the effect of the Western concepts of personal Western concepts it's very kind of reserve view Western people even native like David the article just so there's yourself many can do as well for the simplest way you that all evil comes the center violence should be remedied on material plane and not on the critique of time is acting is 16 is every magical feature for the every not have the power to move to listen action that fosters unlike the rest of the lessons you listen proper edges there's a lack of transparency reality difficult of very good idea theory of self-funding lack of ambrose or even very good research every legislative actual implementation real life just be able to ineffective refuge distance so means that there's supposed to contingent events their critique of time is not a reason as to why debating the resolution is a bad idea and this critique of time has not been applied to a method that their advocacy can solve so you should weigh at the scope of solvency non-reforms to reforms to CJ Supreme prerequisites system abolition assist 18 criminals native people that are colonial management the weakest very secret were able to exception to US you think the abolition every is understanding the digital elimination of equity what you see in our situation people consider reservation of the funding so we have to check up the foundation the better chance is like all the issue of being abolition people also like the check of the society organizing over let me show you secret the army for thing but the Jesus something in our industry people in digital covers goes to being capable of being participate struggle reaching chief goals is think forever just by doors can't be an afterthought their understanding of the state as unified immutable and inevitably dangerous in addition to active creates pessimism and trap that stifles indigenous agency activists collide for 20 customer services such as constituting way indigenous agency overlooking agency or decision as way to action because of the will be because of the track route opening possible shifting realistic entities creating ecology could be I guess ACC's doing we do it for was raised by action just helps to bring state and double play the to raise well like indigenous people reaching the couple days ago, country have Mr. Prashad, this is credible, country rating, ever relationship, ever space, country over structure, it's for the indigenous resistance to acting in your but indigenous can contribute pessimist lands of possibility can create innovative expression. You very likely lead to very deeper conversation. You have on actions and some division which explore creative solution declaration rapidly. Keep roles by doesn't contribute English but any adding moral pessimism versus other than cardiac a pleasure are always over the access after the confidence. You increase negative field division by ages should be pulling resources. One to see symptomatic new political fraud, their representation that the other is something to be saved is nothing more than satisfaction of their own personal desire. The impact is conception of the other in act and divine commodification turns the case hooks 92 the days repulsion you found a very enjoyable difference commodity realities of the offers and you feel like satisfaction normally we waste doing it feeling of safety forever to say you with own clearly democracy object reference about the community to explain no reason says that's to explain desire for the answer critical turn the way and give it every you belongs to full service community culture where express much I think we're working the idea that we're sort of much more as other agency express of your country I can have good for the ultra plus space and contemporary cultural policy only you black that you that's the way to welcome the athlete matches what bring the suffering body into the debate space becomes a prophylatic for violence other bodies are empirically during lecture in the case for lunch and you get political methodology and sentimental promises exist by emancipation identification suffering at least reputation but we're trying to bring the left to explain why emotion percent for the life and probably lost it every just happens to be prophylatic against the over the irreversible feeling condition of us I think it was you much time to start in line with the subject of bargain for mortification really comes to the object of all persons who's going to see the price of the table but who sentimentality is suffering the really use of place subject meaning if these save the addiction it will persist the terrible power comes to the US minors across the others even themselves are ashamed that culture expressed by over-resistance to stereotype. They have no reverse causal evidence about their method about what it spells up to because their evidence is literally about Iran. Their analytic is too abstracted, conflates metaphysical concept with discrete events of oppression policy. Them to a theory granted by history will be the very party they were co-conquer has not a way God's view history that is in their danger when theory when non-falsifiable non-empirical the recent regression confers marches in America so it's a opposite any single explanation versus being wishful and causing domination contextual too complex kept by even our best academic global history world news also unique events with different complex history as well as variety of responsible agent theory have little offer diagnosis and solutions to obviously use a single prism ameliorate evils. Oh, that's the end of the card.
All right. Oh, which cards did you not read from the 1NC? Was it
like the
Papa's evidence and was it the Weiss evidence? Did you read?
Yeah.
Those two cards you did not read.
It was just straight down and then he didn't read the last two.
Okay, yeah. No, it's not the last two. It's like the
After the green pop.
yeah. Okay.
I think that's right.
Okay. Are we good for cross-sex?
Yeah.
Okay. What does like organizing yourselves towards the communist horizon look like?
Forms of organizations in which we advocate for anti-capitalist policies, whether it's in the debate or outside of the debate. For example, advocating for litigation against federal agencies, like, for example, if the Environmental Protection Agency is doing something really neoliberal, then we could organize in organized fashions, create advocacy, educate people about the necessity of changing policies.
Okay, so does a neg ballot do anything to help that organization?
It would impact her in the idea that there is some kind of like value of the ballot that the ballot would prescribe. One of our links are about that because the idea that we can prescribe value upon the ballot as a method of currency is the form of neoliberalism that we critique, i.e. form of like sociality that the 1AC, like for example, if you're like, oh, we don't solve the affirmative because the affirmative creates like a new time space that in which we like invest ourselves, we would impact her in that idea and be like, that's just forms of wishful thinking that prevent us from addressing actual neoliberalism around us.
Do you fiat like forming an organization or doing organizing, or is this just something you are?
We endorse it. We think it's a good strategy to combat neoliberalism.
Okay, so I guess then it's just more of the alt is more just an endorsement of this organization.
It's like the 1AC is an endorsement of a specific strategy. We think the alternative is a counter advocacy or a different strategy that could be.
What reform do you suggest to fix prisons or genocides?
Just like anything that prevents war, like prisoners of war being put in prison. So for example, like Guantanamo Bay, like prisoners would be like banned from being put in Guantanamo Bay. The United States can't take a prisoner of war and.
Can you give me an example of liberalism being reappropriated?
Well, I guess like some forms of interventionism are good in specific ways. We don't think that the resolution calls you to defend forms of liberalism and the idea that you are forced to defend that.
Yeah, well, your heart says
not affirming the resolution is bad, but I'll answer it anyways. Like some forms of liberal like cooperation are good, or like we can use instances where we did not intervene or like where we like did not cooperate. Like for example, like in Rwanda, like when the genocide occurred, like we did not intervene. Like all of those forms of things proves like the necessity of liberalism, the way it can be reappropriated to and lead to some forms of peacekeeping. I know like there's other instances in which interventionism and international cooperation is bad, but we don't think that all forms of scenario planning or like international cooperation is bad.
It's also a defense of contingency. Like the first two lines say that we shouldn't apply these sort of barometers of good and evil across history. Like these things have shifted, they have changed, etc.
Okay. Is the imprisonment of like Lakota people on putting colonial time on them and all the other like material examples we gave too abstract or like metaphysical?
Because those are theories you have presented. You have not presented a way for the 1AC to combat those on a material plane, which is what our ZAC evidence is a critique of. You have over-focused on time and you have not presented a material strategy to combat the harm they face.
I'm just sending cards. This might take me a sec, though. We'll start prep. Okay, 9 minutes. All right, I'm gonna go case, counterplan, framework, cap. Did everyone get the email? Okay. Anybody not ready? Indigenous criminalization and resistance are not linear events, but rather quantum temporalities in which each moment is a superposition of all other moments, i.e. how the ghost dances draw upon infinite histories of prophets and pan-indigenous movements. Remembering through narratization is a material act against the colonial time-making. Prison regimes that reign in prisoners of war cannot access linear distinctions and continuous experiences of torture, make past, present, future into one. The violence of torture becomes a ghostly entanglement that haunts the void, not material, but not nothing, and no thing, and no thingness, whose tensions can be exposed through the sharing of prisoner memoirs, group, process, and competition. One, the judge has a responsibility to disavow colonial education, whether or not the other team magically agrees with us. Two, forcing others to research our argument, even if it's in the context of contestation, still makes settlers recognize the entanglements with the violence of the prison industrial complex. That's the Akbari evidence on the sharing of narratives, creating epistemic breaks. Three, any survival antagonism arguments are terminally non-unique, but empirically disproven by things like the Louisville movement on Academy. One, non-unique, the academy is already colonized. The only question now is their subject formation and educative models. Opaque resistance ensures colonialism researchers itself unchallenged. Two, don't underestimate iterative resistance. Opening character and subject code can ensure that settler values are discontinued. Three, we've made the claim that settler colonialism is sustained through repetitive practices and temporalities which can operate through academia. They don't have an alternative theory of power. Four is the seed the academy just said the university is controlled by the individuals who occupy it. Only insurrections that forward indigenous demands can break free from their critique of square academic discourse. Retraction leads to the immediate loss of power. And for right counterbalancing, they said it doesn't solve. Subjectivity, but cross-play the answers they did to the presumption arguments about the Akbari stuff, the Papas evidence. I'll do the ontology debate here. They're answering the wrong settler colonialism. None of their evidence assumes the temporality of colonial time. Put the burden on them to explain how reforms have fundamentally changed the relationship between the settler and the native. Our argument is not that harm reduction can't happen, rather that the dispossession is continually facilitated by policies that can't account for quantum relationalities. But there's an elasticity to said the USFG makes criminality fluid to ensure that natives are subjugated, i.e. how natives get killed in general in the aftermath of the Dakota Massacre, but were absolved of any crime because calling it murder would also force the Supreme Court to incarcerate the soldiers who had killed the 300 Dakota. Moves that look good on paper, who let natives out of prison, only keep them into a state of amelioration wherein the natives kept alive, only to inflict more violence, traffic more women, and take more land. The ZAC evidence, we don't shut out the possibility of movements. Decolonizing temporalities is a prereq, but that doesn't shut out the possibility of movements like the Zapatistas, who created schools specifically for native education, or Red Power, which Estes co-founded. Those movements directly engage sovereignty, even if they don't directly reform, which their evidence doesn't assume. The Berlans thus cross-apply the answers I did to Academy. There's no alternative to suffering reps, otherwise we don't get to talk about native violence. The Estes evidence it's a wrong reading. His non-reformist reform is only complete abolition, which isn't topical under their definition of framework. The Lightfoot and Papa's evidence, you can cross-apply what I did to ontology earlier, but framing settler colonialism as a structure is good regardless. A allows decolonization to rise to the forefront. Anything else encourages settlers gaslighting indigenous experience, discounting it as untoward narrow-mindedness. B using settler colonial theorizations is the most effective way to map how settlement structures indigenous land inhabitants is operationalized as a genocidal machine. Yes, it's a reverse causal. You just only read one card. The counterplan. Perm do both. The net benefit is divide and conquer, positing survival strategies as zero-sum, pits indigenous people against themselves so that they fight internally rather than fighting the system itself, which allows for white supremacists to fill in independently. There's research to said to the counterplan. It only operates on a large scale, but does nothing to change ingrained research practices within debate, justifies indefinitely pushing back the Fs because we haven't reformed every aspect of criminal justice, doesn't solve the F. One, the vagueness of the plain text ensures that Congress interprets reforming prisoners of war camps to mean making them harsher. Two, the idea of policy reform absolving violence within prisons requires a post-colonial move beyond the past that reifies temporal distinctions and prevents the F epistemic break, which has been shown through narratives to be an invaluable survivor strategy. For prisoners of war framework. Top-level framing issue, understanding the resolution as an immutable force that occupies a void of debate without influence from colonial interactions, ties all violence to a single linear narrative that is insufficient to explain how skills really operate, i.e. how debaters fresh out of high school go to work at the right-wing think tanks that they're after jumping straight from the death penalty to nuclear terrorism. If we win our thesis of quantum relationality, that's a terminal impact turn to how they conceptualize additive linkages between limits, fairness, and skills. Even if debate has aspects of a game, it capitulates our time, has intrinsic linkages to politics, and shapes who we are as people. We meet notions of scale have been blown to bits by the nucleus of a single atom that rework geopolitics and destroyed life worlds in an instant. That's broad. It's impossible to draw clear delineations between macro and micro. There is no sides at which the world switches from quantum to Newtonian, and no calculable distinctions between what is and isn't the USFG. There are infinite institutions within their limits because every bit of matter is threaded through with every possible interaction with everything other, which destroys any possibility of a stasis point. Counterinterpretation. Debates over criminal justice reform should center on strategies to interrogate our entanglements to the violence of the prison industrial complex. This is not an attempt to set a finite number of Fs, which is an impossible task. Rather, our interpretation ensures that discussions are necessitated. The discussions necessitated by debate are tied to material assemblages of the prison industrial complex, which provides core generics, i.e. hedge, crime, BLM, cap, and abolition. And one, ensures that and recognize their entanglements to the complicity of violence of the prison industrial complex, which avoids bidirectional apps and things like FISA and a Coast Guard that skirt the resolutional question. Every interaction and debate is started through with a multiplicity of nuances and how different people read arguments just as fundamentally not distinct from the concept of the stasis. Two, explorations of quantum relationality through Rev debates can only happen in a model where apps aren't required to be tied to the USFG as a linear thing. If they hit candidates will be terrible, then there's escaping to that. They're too busy waiting for some magical god to save them from the horrors of the KF, which obfuscates their own ability to prepare because they have a predisposition to only do policy that isn't resolved under a model where teams can still read the same util blocks on both sides. The link to scapegoating gets magnified if they think that we can't weigh our app because stopping K teams from utilizing their offense creates a self-fulfilling prophecy where they can never create in-depth clash. The other avoidance disad framework subscribes to the Newtonian dichotomy of matter versus void and empty nothingness that justifies settler colonialism, where an uncivilized land is an absent void waiting to be filled. The mind is not empty as they conceptualize it, nor are skills external and ontologically separate forces. Rather, they are always already tied up in the intimacy of violence that entangles settlers selves, regardless of the efficacy of their education. Tying it to a linear framework, script evolutionary imaginaries, and teaches students to be afraid of infinities. Ignoring entanglements of histories is why the ghost dance movements gets conceptualized as pseudo-Christian movements that don't appropriately subscribe to pacifism in order to justify literally making dancing illegal and massacring hundreds. There's a disassociation to the desire to separate our settler subjects from the USFG erases our complicity in native violence in order to leave the colonial project of the United States in the past, where debaters get to say that's what the federal government does, not us, which isn't resolved by anything like switch side debate. Quantum readings of the resolution is the only way to conceptualize debate as a nation-building activity that ensures their skills are recapitulated to enforce settler violence the same way the work of QFT physicists was traded between pure theoretical branches and military technologies and development of the atom bomb. Our debate skills get recapitulated to make us prison planners to smooth over the hiccups of a system founded in genocide. Now on cap. We control the root cause debate. Even if capitalism has interesting explanatory features, it as a theory totally vacates indigenous tactical logic necessary to roll back settler colonial violence. First is global linkages. Purely class-based analysis disavows land as a conduit for resistance used by indigenous movements against settler colonial capitalism. You should ask yourself what their landless description of capital means for tribes securing water rights in the East Pacific, independence fighters in Guam, Palestinian women resisting Israeli settlements. Only land as a collective one unites those resistance groups, which they sabotage by relegating indigeneity to a meta-narrative within the proletariat, which fractures global movements and dehistoricizes the relationship between indigeneity and land. Two, the alternative is functionally unable to access quantum conceptions of time or epistemic breaks from indigenous people because of their teleological focus on organizing. They will try to conceptualize the root cause debate through a linear framework. Capitalism emerged before and ontologically separate from settler colonialism, which is ahistorical and violent. As capitalism emerged in the West, destruction centered around communal Aztec and Mayan civilizations. Purely capitalist frames can explain the exploitation of reservations, but not the elimination, i.e. missing and murdered indigenous women. Three is scarcity. Any relation between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie is enabled by a settler logic of scarcity, which transforms land from an infinite relationality into finite property that can be leveraged against workers. This was manifest in the clearing of indigenous relationality through labor systems that stratified the proletariat terminally where an indigenous land is cleared to make room for capitalism in the ontological system that makes modern capitalism possible. Perm to both and perm to the af and the alt in all their instances. Double bind. If the alt can overcome the entire status quo, it should be able to overcome the residual links to the plan. But be skeptical of any capitalist extinction claims. We don't create a unique brink that pushes us to extinction. Alt fails without also contesting state structures of settler colonialism. They just evolve into exploitation by the state instead of via capital. There's zero hope that the alt is able to mobilize proto-organization in a world where Biden is called a communist. Dispossession is the key tenet of capitalist accumulation. Indigenous genocide is not a byproduct of capitalism, but the structuring principle that animates all social relations. Wing 18. Native genocide and arguably both capitalism, settler colonial destabilized capitalism, dispossession, not the dominant background structure shaping the relations between indigenous peoples and the state's secession through land and genocide elimination that animates indigenous resistance and anti-capitalism. Treat the set of issues as some game off, use the complexity of the processes, analysis of settler colonialism, and vital understanding the operations of racial capitalism.
First question of cross-ex, can you just paste the text of the counter-interp into the chat?
Yeah, sure.
And while you're doing that, I had a question about framework. You said that your interpretation limits bidirectional AFs. What does interrogating our entanglements to the resolution look like? And how do debates like interrogate this? Like, what does it look like?
So argument is that there's sort of like an infinity of like interactions that people can have in debate. Rather, the counterinterpretation ensures that those sort of interactions are directly tied to the ways in which settler selves are sort of entangled with how the prison industrial complex operationalizes violence, and they have to forward some sort of like tactic to be able to combat that.
I'm just confused about how you could say your interpretation is limiting when one, you have said that it.
Yeah, there are two main warrants for limits. First is bidirectionality. We think any like coherent interrogation of our violence within the prison industrial complex would necessitate a reduction of it. Two is like we limit out any like apps that skirt the topic question of criminal justice reform, like FISA, Coast Guard, patents, cloud computing, all of the sort of like big stick apps on this topic that run away from the question of criminal justice towards like nuclear terror extinction impacts.
You haven't even defined criminal justice as a term of art, so I'm confused how you can clarify what is core of the topic and what is not core of the topic.
Definitely Akbari and Barad talk about what prisons are and aren't. We don't think we have to like reread our cards in the TOC just to have like a definition when it's from our theory of power.
Okay, the theory of power. I'm confused about what the affirmative does to change this position of time. It seems like this is like ingrained within the way that the United States conceptualizes indigenous folks. So I'm confused. Post-affirmative.
Yeah, our argument is not that like clock time stops existing when the judge votes affirmative, but quantum temporalities can exist as sort of like relationships between people and how we conceptualize things like the way debate works as like a combination of processes rather than like an additive, we get like more skills, more limits, more fairness. We don't think we have to win that like when the judge votes affirmative, the USFG stops using colonial time. But Akbari says that like prisoners living within quantum relationalities and the sharing of the narratives in which they do that is essential to allow them to not be trapped within like a present that doesn't have a past or a future. It's the only way that they're able to sort of like understand violence that is happening to them and create any sort of epistemic breaks. That also operates through things like the ghost dance movements, where indigenous people can like dance in circles and then lay dead, exhausted, and interact with their loved ones who are gone but in the present.
So the creation of these narratives under a debate model, like, do you expect people to have conflicting narratives and debate about that? In debate, where like
we are not like creating these narratives in debate. It's a reading of like narratives that indigenous people have experienced. Debate is not just like making these things up.
But why is reading those narratives like reverse causal for any of the harms that you described?
Yeah. First, the thing about like epistemic breaks, which is like how people experience time that is operationalized to dispossess them. Second is the Akbari evidence about how like the sharing of prisoner narratives and memoirs can sort of decolonize temporal imaginaries and allow for resistance.
We started prep, by the way.
Okay, stop prep. Mole, can you put the time in the chat? I'm sending out cards and like, text. Okay, the order is going to be T in case. Just give me a sec to change my camera input. Okay, maybe it's not going to work. Never mind. Let me know when everyone got the doc.
Yeah, I just got it.
And Evelyn, you have it too. Public laws must defend implementation of national criminal justice reform in the United States using federal government action. Debate is a game. This was dropped in the 2AC that requires a judge that evaluates arguments, makes decisions. It is not good for making us loyal to any particular content, political organization, or for pushing us towards the subjectivity of decolonized time or anything else. The negative must prove why debate is key to their offense. Otherwise, you should vote negative on presumption. That means you must determine whether it's reasonable to debate them before you weigh the AF against T. The impacts of debatability and clash. Two internal links. First, predictable limits. Limited topic serves as a stasis point for both sides to have an equal opportunity to win. Otherwise, debates competitive incentive creates a race to the margin, which distorts research. It turns the app challenging competition to a limited model, creates improved conversation, actionable strategies to resist all instances of colonized time that we observe in our own lives. B is grounded here to the resolution, ensures a vibrant literature base and in-depth clash rather than alternative models of debate, which with ground allocated to us by the app. One error defense will rely on concessionary ground, which is not the basis for debate over the year. The Raquel evidence says that it turns the app because the only way to rid students of media-induced biases and misconceptions about the deviancy of the Lakota's practices, the innate criminalization of the ghost dance, etc., is having this ground and switching sides over it, preserving competitive equity and fairness is intrinsic good speech times, prep time, losing when cheating, such clipping cards, etc. This is important because they can't be distinguished from our ability to prepare pre-round and pre-tournament. They conceded that it brackets out substance and any disadvantage to topicality since it's secondary to fairness is questioning of debate's playability. In the first place, you have an obligation as a judge and a competitive activity to correct the fairness violation by voting neg. Our interpretation also solves the case better. They set the threshold and want to see cross-examination using debate as a space to challenge the normative perspective of the criminalization of indigenous practices. The Estes card that we read on case in the 1C says that this criminalization is tied to stereotypes caused by policies, and the Raquel evidence, which they dropped, says that our model solves better. Using the explicit word that debating the multiple sides challenges stereotypes about crime and offenders from the media. They should not get any new answers. In the one error, the llama, like first they say that it understands the resolution as a linear narrative. But we don't understand the resolution as immutable. It's very flexible. It's not a linear narrative. I'll do the TVA debate over here. There are three. First, the United States federal government should abolish prisons and by extension prison labor and political prisoners. That is tied to all of the 1AC evidence, which indicates that these are the manifestations of colonized time. Second, new Cheers Act from this year. The United States federal government should reaffirm the jurisdiction of public governments in the sentencing and policing felonies committed on reservations. Third, the United States federal government should abolish the criminal justice system. Here's an advocate from 1AC evidence. Colonial time is fundamentally about imposed policy that which the TVAs would break down. Akbari Tabar 17. Government powers colonized through wage work and person system for the colon is a relationship with wage work and off the cost house. These affirmatives would be better at explaining the relationship between the state, the person, and temporality. You can include an analysis of narratives or discussion of what time means to natives while also having a very radical proposal to break down the entire criminal justice system. This explains their thesis better because there's no separation between internalized fears and biases and the policies that make these biases tangible and material. You could even go further to break down temporality by including imaginations or theoretical stories like Lexington BY, but BY's app this year and last year gives you options, but also lets neg teams respond to the plan and have debates over those sorts of methods. The next argument is that debaters would go to work in the right wing. This isn't true. You maybe have two examples max of people that have become right wing after debate. The vast majority becomes more liberal, more informed, and even if they don't, what really matters for subject formation is whether we switch sides. You dropped the Raquel evidence that was above. Not all teams would read nuclear war under our interpretation. Actually, at the TOC, most apps are soft left because criminal justice reform allows you to have very radical proposals. They say that debate changes our subjectivities. One, we shouldn't have to win a spill of. The idea that individual debates, even over the period of time of a year, can cause any material change is naive at best and complicit in the system that they critique at worst. Debaters don't believe the arguments that they read at all, proven by the fact that people already read these sort of inane impacts that don't pass the SIF test. Second, even if you believe that advocacy skills matter, we solve it better because we teach debaters to be empathetic by research, thinking about switching sides, seeing the other viewpoint, and then convincing them that they are wrong if they truly are wrong. It is better for debaters to reach these sort of assumptions about the way that colonized time functions over an iterative process in which they see both sides. Third, it's not a one-to-one plan equals activism claim, but a process makes us more likely to push for that. The next argument is we meet. They definitely do not, quote, reworking geopolitics, not the use of the federal government to reform the criminal justice system. They would have to abolish police, abolish forfeiture, abolish prosecution courts, etc., but they don't. Delineating the micro and macro level of violence is definitely possible, especially when their own 1AC evidence is that the manifestation of quantum entanglement comes through policies. They're not. The next argument is the sort of no calculable limit stuff. I'll do our limits offense below, but only we have to find who the federal government is. So we don't get to say that we have maximum limits because they literally do not have an agent. I'll explain more of that below. The next argument is the counterinterpretation. At the top, you should reject it. They did not counter-define any words in the resolution, but the resolution is the only thing available to both teams. It also matters that literally zero indigenous scholars have defined criminal justice reform to mean an interrogation of our entanglement to it, so they have not created the space necessary for that scholarship. I'll do some of our offense over here. First is limits. In quote, interrogating or entanglement with the structures of mass incarceration is so untenable. What counts as an entanglement? Is it an individual story about how you interacted with cops? Is it not stable? It's not stable at all because POMO teams with an interrogation as boat shared and somehow connect those two lines together. Here's some more specifics. One, they don't specify the specific agent, makes it impossible because there are 300 million people in the United States and even more in countries like Iran, for example. Second, they don't specify a mechanism for changing those sorts of entanglements. Third, it does not require them to propose a change from the status quo. Their counterinterpretation makes every app an analysis which allows them to shift to moral truism journalism was like, yes, the massacre of the Lakota was bad, which might be true and might be benign in intent, but is not stable for debate at all. Second piece of offense is ground. All of our offense is predicated off of using the federal government. Their interpretation nullifies them because it does not require an advocacy statement. Any ground that they would offer is very concessionary, and it would be terrible because what are we supposed to say? The Lakota massacre was a good idea, or the ghost dance should be prosecuted, etc. This should also turn all of their quantum entanglement offense. Interrogation is not enough when real structures are the ones causing violence. More of this on the case, which will be in the one in our most. It doesn't avoid bidirectional asks. There are way too many ways to interrogate entanglements out. And what's above? Their next argument is Rev v. Rev. Group all of them. One, you can still have debates over methods in our model. Read quantum entanglement on the negative, which solve all of your offense. Second, Rev v. Rev debates in a vacuum with the app reading interrogation and the negative reading some other method that is somehow supposed to contradict them would be not good because the permutations, think about the cap K every single time when you get to re-clarify what exactly your advocacy statement is when it wasn't stable since it was an interrogation in the first place. They said that we're waiting for magical horror versus chaos. We might use util blocks, for example, on both sides, but it's undeniable that switching sides is possible and beneficial. The Raquel evidence offensive by saying that people's minds only change when they're put in positions that they might initially disagree with. They say scapegoating, policing, surveillance, and boarding schools are bad, not because they set regulations, but because of the regulations that they set. For example, the cops are bad because they manipulate rules in a fashion that target indigenous and black communities. For example, they engage in unfair incarceration and boarding schools. All of these are claims that the YC has agreed with. However, applying this to topicality is a laughing stock because topicality is the only side of intersectional analysis. Ultimately, everyone has to be neg, and universal prescriptions of fairness are necessary. Anything else evolves into terrible logic that they themselves have critiqued and justifies other debaters or non-black debaters like them reading untopical asks against debaters that are indigenous, for example, which creates a power dynamic based on concessionary on the ground. They say that it's justifying it. Tying it to a linear frame is bad. Still no link. How do we tie this to a linear frame at all? I did a massive explanation on the TVA debate that you can still have alternative imaginations. You can include personal narrative to disrupt these sorts of linear notions of time, etc. All of this is still possible. They say that debaters are detached and that makes it prison planners. First, debaters being detached is inevitable in a competitive game. Remember, they conceded that debate is a game, so the only thing debaters are thinking about during research, during tournaments, is how best they can win. That makes it impossible for it to reliably change their subjectivities. This will also be a presumption argument on the case when I go there little, and I already answered the argument that makes his prison planners on the second argument on slow the case. Vote negative on presumption. The idea that the ballot can affirm the presentation of narratives is asked then in part and parcel with our critique. The inability for the act to present a material strategy that can justify what the rereading of time looks like, how that discourse exists, isn't the issue of the model of politics that chooses leftist abstraction. Want to see one? They dropped the ball here. All of our presumption arguments were defense and turns to the ask mechanism of solvency. Using debate as an advocacy makes it fail because competition undergirds all of our allegiances. Camp, coaching, new apps. All of these are reasons why the game, like qualities of debate, control the way that we relate to each other in debate and not their broader theories of power. That's why the rule of balance and vote for the team that does the better debating. It's the only non-arbitrary standard, and anything else would link to our offense. Our model encompasses the role of ballot, but ensures an equitable role for the negative. Also, we have proven on the other page that our sort of interpretation is the permutation of the quantum entanglement stuff as per the TVA, so they really don't have a debate keyword here at all. We've also actually, that's fine.
Okay, are you good?
Sorry, I said yeah.
What's the distinction between what is and isn't concessionary ground?
Concessionary ground is everything that is not decided by the resolution.
Okay, what process counterplans are decided by the resolution?
There's like a bunch of definitions based on like resolutional wording.
That
like
prescribe disads?
Enact. Sorry, what?
That prescribe disads, those definitions do?
Well, yeah. I mean, the resolution means something. It requires the app to defend something. Disads would be predicated off that action.
Cool. Why is the hedge disad not like prescribed by those definitions?
The hedge disad might be. I mean, if an app uses criminal justice to establish better hedge, then hedge disad might be prescribed.
Okay, cool. The Rev v. Rev debate stuff, you said that you force people to like be in places that they disagree with. In a world where affirmatives can't read K-ass, where are policy teams faced with something that they disagree with?
Wait, that's just such a massive homogenization of the apps that would happen under our term. We've had multiple arguments on the TVA debate that we could have very radical proposals. For example, a policy debater might not agree with abolishing the police. You could then read an app that abolishes the police and prove that it solves criminalization of indigenous people, criminalization of black communities, etc.
Okay, what's the distinction between abolition, like the policy AF, and abolition, the KAF? What process counterplans and like politics Congress decides do you
Okay,
get?
so
against
first of all,
abolition TBA?
you're focusing too much on ground. We've also made a much larger limits argument about why an interrogation doesn't even mean that people are going to read the abolition KAF. Like, people will shift to moral truisms and analysis of their own personal narrative, which is so untenable.
Sure, but that's not my question. What ground do you get against the TBA?
Ones that
What?
use the federal government.
Disads
Ground based on the
that are
federal
easily
government
prescribed
acting
by the
to do
regulation
that.
you get against an affirmative that embellishes the entirety of the curriculum.
Obviously, there's some ground overlap, but there is also a massive limits distinction and a massive ground distinction based on the federal government's usage.
Okay.
Like, think about an abolition KAF that used, for example, grassroots movements or community organizers to perform that abolition metaphorically. That might be an abolition KAF, but it doesn't give us any ground.
What's the bright line for like how many rounds we have to debate in before it shapes our subjectivity? If like one round can't do it,
That's our point. There's no bright line.
do-
There can't be a bright line because debate is not designed to do that. And there's no way to know whether that has truly happened or whether that your debate model has accomplished anything.
Okay, then how do you access a skills impact if there's no way to ever know?
Well, that's not like our major piece of offense. It's the reason why we solve the AF and why our interpretation is also like better. It's offense against, specifically designed against the way that you worded your interpretation. And also, we're the only ones reading criminal justice specific evidence about why switch side debate is what challenges misunderstandings, misconceptions, biases, and quote, prepares criminal justice professionals if they want to be community organizers that pursue abolition in the real world. The Raquel evidence is so good. It's like the best framework card you will ever read on this topic.
The order is case and then cap K. Let me know when everyone's good to go. There's no cards.
Well, I'm just taking like a second to prep here. We'll start on the number 2 on case because I already did the number 1.
Okay. Okay, everyone's good to go. Wait, sorry, but I'm gonna take a second to prep. Wait, I'll call me. Pick 20. Now I'm good. Sorry about that. We've impacted the idea that people should be forced to respond to other people's identities. It's violent to negate someone else's identity, encourages oppression Olympics, and it would be useless because debaters research to win. That's proven by the fact that no matter how much I lose to Russia or good, it does not mean that I'll ever think that it's a good argument. And apparently they've dropped that the Niemeyer evidence, which is a behavioral study, and it's cognitive, and it proves that deliberations don't change people subjectivity because humans have zero sense of empathy. The Louisville example is asinine. Obviously, K debate is on the increase and things have changed over time, but it's unethical for them to just name drop the Louisville project without explaining why the accumulation of ballots for them actually solves so they don't actually have a good ballot key warrant. 2 implications about all these computation and process arguments. First is that this impact turns a vast majority of their strategy as it creates more exclusion because it creates allies based on competition rather than those who genuinely support your project. Second is that you should vote negative on presumption. We don't need an alternative theory of power because there is zero reason to affirm their project as it does not help them challenge macropolitical structures that produce the harms that when I see the university just said it's largely answered on the TVA, but it proves that we don't limit you to one interpretation, and the idea that they are that it could prove the avoidance of creativity in our model encourages forms of innovation that increases thinking and is an impactor to prove why limits are good. The critique of liberalism through ontology is completely incorrect. Papa's evidence is excellent and says that using this as a starting point to talk about European and Eurocentric imaginations for the way that settler colonialism is constructing moots agency and forms of process. In fact, the lighthouse evidence talks about the immutability creating a form of pessimistic trap by denying agency supported autonomy, which prevents forms of decolonization and anti-discrimination movements. It talks about tons of movements and going steps in the right direction, but critiques the reform of academia, even if our evidence is largely different from the theory of power that they prescribed at that time. We've impacted the idea that things should not be prescribed on a material page. This elasticity disadvantage is not correct. This is just a reason as to why policies fail as terminal impact defensive solvency, because they have no reverse causal evidence that proves that the reframing of their AF can actually solve, because they've just has said there's optimistas, but they've not proven why their model of framework or why affirming their ballot or voting for them would solve any of this, or why endorsing them would solve the huckster. And I'll extend it here. It should be a TKO because they've dropped the evidence. I only think they responded to the Berlant evidence. So I'm going to be, there's no way they get new answers next speech. Frame the critique as a decide the introduction of the 1EC. Our argument is not that the content of the 1EC is wrong, but the way it was presented is manifest in colonial thinking that makes solvency impossible. Trying to incorporate the narrative of the subaltern from a position of privilege does not just relay the message of the oppressed, it infuses the message with Western liberal thought, where encounter with alterity can engender a transposition in subjectivity as itself a revolutionary process that's not the liberal subject's deconstruction, but its ultimate solidification, so they can leave this ground and be, quote, woke. Here's a gut reaction question for you. What does voting ever actually do? The answer is nothing. There's a reason why activators are here in this small room instead of in front. So many more people. That's actually because that actually have the means to change the way we view the subaltern. The ballot is an ends, not a mean. An affirmative ballot does not translate at all into a shift in the way the U.S. colonized the subaltern. A ballot is just a win for the affirmative and nothing more, nothing less. And convincing yourself that it's something more than that is asinine. The 1EC has reduced itself into a blank check for colonized subject and has seen the call of the emotional power of the absolute Russianists. They reduce the suffering of entire populations, so battering ram turns their subjectivity claims because it reduces the subaltern to an all temporal historical commodity of cross-continental trade. They have only responded to suffering groups. They have not responded to a massive commodification term. So this should just be a TKO because it's like they've conceded a critique on the case page. The Berlant, and I'll extend here, the 1EC offers you, the judge, a transaction. Listen to their story, identify what they're suffering, and for the small cost of an affirmative ballot, engage in their movement by presenting the narratives of other native people you might not even relate to. That's the Berlant evidence. Cause scholars and judges to invest in sentimental relations to suffering, which reproduce the repetition of pain at the discursive level without doing anything material. The Zach evidence reaffirms this statement because it proves that not challenging the material plane, it trades academia into elites of a draining of capital because it prevents actual movements from getting off the ground, which proves that even if they are rejected, those two things are mutually exclusive and it leads to more harm in the status quo. Two implications. First is innocence. The 1EC pacifies actors because they can feel, quote, down with the revolution without doing anything, which is the ultimate example of whiteness. It allows for moves towards innocence as their own privilege and position within the system is never called into question. Think people who donate in the Salvation Army thinking they're stopping poverty, but then they go on to invest within the capitalist system that is responsible for that material condition in the first place. You can vote neg on presumption because they do not challenge the macropolitical structure of violence. B is vampirism. Berlant claims that once identification with suffering and racialized tropes elicits a response, the repetitious cycle of these narratives begins to circulate, causing an overproliferation of racialized images. The quantitative increase causes a qualitative shift towards greater identification with minoritarian stereotypes and a simplification of the subject into one-dimensional narratives. This proves that their trope about multidimensional time are easily palatable to gain recognition from whiteness, which only re-entrenches tropes of inferiority. Turns the case because the 1EC literally partakes in their own otherization, which is why only the alts' refusal to partake in this economy of science solves. The alternative is causing for demands on the part of the United States federal government instead of rereading narratives. You can think of this as another counter-advocacy because we picked out their call to the resolution by detaching themselves while also engaging for the suffering and reading the narratives of people who they might even not relate to because they've empirically drained them of life within and outside the debate in round impact because their discourse is violent and problematic. The I'm not going for it, but this forms of infinite deferral is also a reason that they've completely dropped this. Dean evidence proves that this leads to an endless case of resentment where we're unable to actually challenge anything material because we're so lost in this process of academia and discourse that we're unable to solve anything on a material plane.
Okay, 9 minutes. Okay, stop recording.
All right. No new cards. The order is going to be case and framework. Is everyone good?
Just give me 1 second. My timer just needs to. There's that thing where like it becomes really light and stuff. So just give me 1 second.
Okay.
Okay, it's
All right. Is everyone else ready? First on case, linear time is operationalized through imprisonment to mediate the possibility for the positions. Prisoner narratives wherein violence is experienced via quantum and temporality are key to expose the tension of colonial time on presumption. The competition stuff, it's not unique. Debate already criminalized quantum conceptions, but Akbar says that sharing in nonlinear narratives is able to create epistemic break for settlers who are forced to confront the intimacy of their entanglements with violence as they cut cards against us. That's not necessary for absolvency anyway. The Louisville project does prove that more people aligned with KS or at least engage in research with them when they lose. This is especially true given the visibility of the TOCs on the identity stuff. We aren't forcing you to challenge anyone's identity. We'll provide ground you could have read on the framework flow, but you specifically chose to run to framework instead of engaging with our literature or reading any alternative theory of power, neither of which force you to say genocide is good. On the Pappas and Lightfoot stuff and like the reform, all that, they're answering the wrong form of ontology. They haven't proven any examples that undo the ways in which the use of operationalized colonial time for violence, and they drop that we don't shut out movements that engage sovereignty. There are just assume that reform is the only kind of resistance on Berlant. You shouldn't have dropped the academy cost application. The arguments are more simple than you think they are. One is that they dropped the academy commodification, terminally non-unique. There's no bring to the F grades where white liberals suddenly start thinking they're doing good things. So there's just the F sound dominant linear narratives that force settlers to recognize complicity and violence. Two, they dropped the solvency mechanism for sharing narratives. Akbar says that epistemic destabilized settlers which should take out competition turns too, but SS built upon it by talking about boarding school educated indigenous people writing about ghost dance movies, what allowed it to become so widespread. That's a direct impact on any pacification or vampirism arguments. Three, don't have a theory of powers. The House Ecole doesn't operate in academia, which means the critique is an attempt to make resistance obscure and shut out narratives that internally turn out ways on reducing subaltern. And four, the F solves responsibility infinitely better. There's no alternative to the K, which means they default back to the scope of responsibility is only ever invoked towards the past, whereas the affirmative for the model of relationality towards the present and future, all that are engaged in particular on moving towards the post-colonial future that absolves violence on framework. Top level, there's a functionally conceited scapegoating to said that was under review web debates. The 2NC answered the wrong argument. Their determination to find their decent policy education in opposition to the indecent critical affirmative ignores the explosion of critical ath literature and ensures they can never prepare for more than half the debate rounds. At worst, this is the reason we get framework to says because everyone. Anything else ensures zero class. Extend the counter-interpretation. Debates over criminal justice reform to center strategies to interrogate our entanglements to the violence of the prison industrial complex. It ensures that acts are tied to materialist images of the prison industrial complex. There are conceded examples of bidirectional and big acts that we limit out, which outweighs their examples of multiple entanglements. We agree, but those entanglements are still tied to criminal justice reform, which provides hedge, crime, BLM, and cap and abolition. Any act without attacking just loses the presumption, which is a sufficient functional limit. And they say definitions key, but one, no, they're not. Not everyone reads Erickson. Two, it's in the broad evidence, and the avoidance is said. This was completely mishandled. Framework is Newtonian dichotomy of matter versus the void, justifying set of cleanses by being uncivilized land is a void to be filled. The mind is not empty, and skills are not external and ontologically separate forces. They're always tied up with the violence that entangles settlers themselves. The skills that develop would be deployed by settlers who tie their education to a linear frame, records, revolutionary imaginaries, and teach students to fear infinities. Ignoring these entanglements of history justifies genocide on rev debates. They could have read pessimism, queer pessimism, anti-blackness, cap, psycho, because they're all competing methods and analyzing settles them through different theories of power. The ground they want operates under a singular power frame that creates an echo chamber which turns truth testing in clash. The debate should be a question of revolution testing, not complacency with the system. On the TVA, one, abolition of the KF and abolition of the policy F are not fundamentally distinct because the state theoretically ceases to exist in either scenario. They still lose process kind of plans, elections, this, that, and all this in exact ground they lose against our F, which creates a double bind. Either our F provides division ground to debate us, or their models incapable of solving any of their impacts. And two, any TVA solves none of the F. If we win our thesis level arguments about the settlers like intemporality, linear progression narratives, ensuring that restricting presidential authority over nuclear first use or giving back tribal sovereignty, which it seems to us if he had it in the first place, even with a critical advantage, is not interpreted as an ethical encounter. Remember to the violence of nuclearism, but overcoming of that violence by rolling into the past and gone. Three, targeting to sad. The debates to say solve the case still focus on the centrality of the state as the operative agent for settler violence, which the embodied role of everyday settlers and our effective investment occupation. The TVA can never solve when winning the colonial exists on a level below state behavior. Limiting any discussion of a K or utility generic form batting themselves debates of meaningful content. It could explain and cross how you incorporate any of our literature while using state not our board to do their work for them. On switch that debate. One, switch side debate assumes an absolute separability between AF and A, where in the forum debate, divergent policy gets to the content of their arguments, but extend that the most likely version of the debate is one where everyone reads AF framework and the AF rhetoric continues to talk a nuke terror on both sides. That's terminal defense to clash and improve the quantum imaginary shutdown without the possibility of critiquing the resolution from the AF. And two, this magnifies the avoidance side by assuming that we can be entirely except from the content of our arguments, allowing us to put skill to inhabit an empty. Yes, debate produces bad people. Larry Summers, Ted Cruz, Neil Katyal, Lawrence Tribe, Karl Rove. We can keep giving examples, but we don't need to spend the whole speech doing that. Three, switch side debate is a false promise. Another industry to be broken. This model debate that further skewed against critique, but obviously limit on eggs as well. Even if it doesn't make its move in, and I actually believe turns advocacy into a setter product and decent progress on fairness. Our offense outweighs, even if fairness isn't trending good, they have to compare the tangible impacts of setter structures policy, which enables it is impossible to win an insulated impact versus the risk that we actively change material miles, and at worst, the counter solves all the internal links on clash. One, with impact on the value debates pedagogy, which means all the intrinsic benefits of clash. Framework is a sequence question, means not about how many skills that clash skills, but those skills are about. They don't have an external impact of clash other than skills which the external impact turns. And two, at worst, the counter interpret results of whatever residual offense you think they get, especially when their model less policy to make 10 new assets every tournament. The topic becomes a little discussion when declining to the ones of the resolution. They're reading Estes wrong. No examples of reform he actually advocates for because their ev isn't reverse causal.
I'm just gonna call Mahol and then we'll start. Okay, it's case and then T. Is everyone good? They have zero reverse causal evidence about how they resolve time, colonize time, and what their spaces look like. We have three main pieces of offense against their ballot. One is commodification, formal position of privilege, and incorporating narratives of indigenous folks from views of the message with Western liberals. If it's like white girls on Instagram when they post hashtag B11 think that they're somehow woke, they've considered there's a reason why there aren't that many people in the round because voting app doesn't actually do anything. The YC turns indigenous folks turn into battlegrounds and colonizes subjects through a strategy that classifies their position as quote inferior. Their non-unique argument is new in the 1A and sandbags next strategy, but evaluate through this their drop turns case argument above. The 1A extended zero warrants why suffering reps are good, so there's only a risk of our offense because ballot is purely an and. I mean, second, identity focus is better arguments by negating someone's personal narratives, insulated from their argument that we can say other things other than genocide good is that privileged debaters play a portion in Olympics in an issue that they cannot possibly engage with. It implicates the role of the ballot and a reason why voting for them encourages more psychic violence for indigenous folks in the debate space. Third is false allyship. All of our competition arguments on framework turn political subjectivity because you do not form allies. You generally support your project because strategy trumps personal belief, which is another reason why their model is violent. Debate is not criminalized because of multiple interpretations of the topic as per TVA, but they haven't explained how they address that necessarily. The 1A has no material examples of how they reconfigure identity, politics. How do they prevent Black people in debate from getting the cops called them? What do they do about Native people who are imprisoned outside of debate, etc.? How do they escape the clamps of the government? What is accumulating TOC wins due to rewire subjectivity? None of these questions were answered, and the 1A, all of the case arguments undercut their ability to garner any impact turn to framework. Go to the topic county page. Both the 2AC and the 1A conceded a role of the ballot game. Your foremost responsibility in this debate as a judge in competitive activities to choose a winner in an equal contest. You should vote negative to correct the fairness violation. This was in the 1 and C, the 2 and C, so they should not get 2A or answer because this decided to in our strategy. The app considered three reasons why fairness outweighs everything else. One is competition. Debate is a game that was conceded in the 2AC and the 1A are undergirds everything in bracket out substance because it ponders the playability or usability of the game that they have called into question. Second, the ballot, the extension of linear time into debate is extended through broader institutions like state policies and stigma, which our ballot cannot solve, but you voting negative rectifies our inability to engage. This matters because only we have solvency. Your RFD should say you cannot weigh colonized time in debate against fairness if the ballot cannot resolve the imposition of colonized time in debate. Third, it's an intrinsic good. None of their impact terms will matter because they've asked you to judge with line by line and value drop arguments. We can't speak for longer than 5 minutes, etc. And treating this matters. We even read a behavioral study from Ritter to support this, and the case arguments. I'll answer there are those at the bottom though of the 1A. Fairness outweighs tangible impacts to settlerism. One, the ballot cannot meaningfully change settler practice outside of debate that are created by structures like school, education, income inequality, etc. Second, fairness turns it. Structural inequality gets magnified by procedural unfairness. All of a sudden, indigenous debaters or people who are being oppressed by mass incarceration have to respond to a KF that they weren't prepared for. The scapegoating argument. This was not dropped in the 2 and C. What are you talking about? The 1A was also going super fast here. Didn't really have warrants. You should give leniency for 2 in our responses. One, we never said that KF for some demons that always have to be excluded, but just that it would be it is better for affirmative teams to read a policy so that the neg could say something against that. Second, scapegoating is non-unique and inevitably because there will always be people getting mad at others to say lost to that affirmative. Third, it happens under their interpretation more because neg teams might blame the app for the interrogation that they read. Fairness outweighs is much more worse to not be able to debate overall the counter interpretation. I'll explain our limits offense here since I shouldn't have to redo the work because they just dropped it in the 1A. Interrogating our entanglements is so untenable. They did not define any words in the context of the resolution. You should think of it as a fundamentally unlimited topic. Every debater has their own personal relationship with mass incarceration, so they get infinite agents. They don't need a mechanism for that interrogation, so infinite methods, and it does not require a change from the status quo, so infinite forms of analysis. It makes it literally impossible for the neg to engage. So debate breaks down. Losing presumption is not a functional limit because interpretation says that an interrogation is a legitimate app, so presumption just wouldn't exist. They said that we get hedge cap and abolition. We aren't really going for ground. It's about limits more so, and no, we wouldn't get those against an app that's simply doing analysis of their own personal relationship. They say avoidance is said, look, the only threshold for encouraging subjectivity formation or participation was reading the scholarship in the 1AC. The TVA's definitely solved this. They did not respond to the TV argument sufficiently. Think about the 1AC thesis. They said that temporality flows through everything and exists at the state level in countries like Iran and police practices in the United States and in individual relationships. All of the TVAs allow for analysis of those relationships as well as a radical proposal to break down imposed policies, abolishing prisons, prison labor, political prisoners, etc. They have solvency advocates and when tied with experience would have the best discussion of temporality ever, even though it doesn't have to solve better. It actually does because their model is just interrogation, which means they don't teach debaters to notice colonized time in legal structures when they leave debate. It outweighs because this is more valuable education. Switch side, they said mine is empty and skills are not separate. I'll do the switch side debate over here. First, all of their dissats that were in the 1A are answered and solved by reading on the negative. They dropped this in the 1A. If they're right that defending the state is bad in all instances, they get to say so in 50% of debates. The Raquel evidence is the best framework card you have read on this topic. It is far better to reach their own conclusions about these positions through defending positions that they might initially pose and then realizing that they are definitely wrong. So they have to convince others on both sides and then they arrive at the heart of the issue. This outweighs the Raquel evidence is that this is what breaks down the criminality of indigenous practices, challenges stereotypes put forward by by the media and is in line with their evidence. Group their reg arguments first. You can still have debates over methods like Afropest, queer pessimism, or other forms of quantum entanglement under our model. That was a TVA debate. Second, these debates would not be good because of permutations. Once again, that was a dropped argument. The rest of the arguments about the TVA abolition as a KF and abolition or TF, that is literally irrelevant to the fact that your interpretation allows a bunch of individual analyses, but the TVA is allowed for concrete discussions of how temporality relates to the actual space. This is an E and egg mallet. Fairness is larger with more solvency, and we have inroads to their offense through TVAs and switch side.
Okay, 130, 125. Okay, case framework. Okay. Is everybody good? They have conceded our thesis of relationality that indigenous criminalization and resistance are not linear events, but rather quantum temporalities in which each moment is a superposition of all other moments, i.e. how the ghost dances draw upon infinite histories of prophets and pan-indigenous movements. That's distinct from the cross-application they tried to do on framework. All of the stuff that they go for in the 2NR is terminally non-unique. It wasn't a new argument in the 1IR, it was on Academy in the 2AC, but the impact is at best turns case, which doesn't operate if they don't have an alternative theory of power, because we're winning some offense that the status quo of linear debate is really bad. That all of their examples about white people posting hashtag BLM just prove that it's already non-unique. Codification happens in the SCO. There's no distinction that 2NR makes between more commodification post-affirmative, which means there's absolutely no chance of offense, here. But remembering through narrowization is a material act against the colonial time-making prison regimes. A Iranian prisoner of war cannot access linear distinctions as continuous experiences of torture, but that make past, present, future into one. Sharing of those narratives is able to create epistemic breaks, which is from Akbari and Estes, which goes conceded in the 2AC. The identity politics stuff is not our affirmative. You don't have to debate against the identity of specific people. Again, the impacts are non-unique, but competing methods debates solve it. The computation stuff about forming bad allies still doesn't have any sort of external impact and doesn't matter in the context of the framework debate. It's not getting them anywhere on framework. The scapegoating dissent is an independent reason to vote affirmative. It's consistently answered wrong and completely wrong in every negative speech, which means you give me every bit of leeway and have a super threshold of voting. I know you said the word scapegoating, but you don't know what this argument is. Their interpretation obfuscates their own ability to prepare. It's structured towards the perfectly decent Eden of policy debate that never really existed and never will be, which ensures that they're not prepared for like 50% of their debates, because every time they hit a KF, they just resort back to framework. Having some debates against KFs is a net benefit to voting AF, even if we don't have a counter interpretation, because their model is never able to access debates about the deliberation of our tactics and movements, even if it's limited, because they never accept the possibility of debating a KF. Being ontologically predispositioned to always go for policy creates self-fulfilling prophecies that eviscerate any possibility of clash, which is the only external impact coming out of the 2NR, even though it's globally extended, which means it doesn't matter if access a TVA, their model can never access any intrinsic benefits to fairness that they think exist for the sake of the game. Scapegoating is terminal defense to that, and combined with our offense, the F is the only team with a risk of an external impact of framework. I'll do the avoidance dissent at the top as well, because all of our dissents to fairness go conceded because all of our dissents go to fairness go functionally conceded the justification for colonial context is the Newtonian dichotomy of an empty void waiting to be filled, whose matter is determined by external and ontologically separate forces. This is proven by their arguments about how the content can be separated from the form of debate. If we win a thesis level claim that all matter and time is entangled, then framework's dichotomy of form versus content, where clash exists, is ontologically separate from the content of their arguments, and where skills are waiting to fill some sort of empty mind that's not entangled with the intimacies of settler violence, is not only patently false, but ties all analysis to a linear frame that restricts revolutionary imaginings, where students are only ever worried about restricting relational infinities. The first implication of that is that students can only conceptualize progress through linear analysis, which is what allows native movements to be criminalized. There's a conceited example about how ignoring historical entanglements is why ghost dances get conceptualized as pseudo-Christian, that don't appropriately subscribe to pacifism in order to justify literally making dancing illegal and massacring hundreds, because it's a terminal impact turned to any sort of external benefit to fairness or clash. The second implication is skills conceptualizing debate as a nationally building activity that ensures their skills are recapitulated to enforce settler violence is only possible through the affirmative, the same way the work of QFD physicists was traded between pure theoretical branches in military technologies and the development of the atom bomb. And our debate skills get recapitulated to make us prison planners, to smooth over the hiccups of a system founded in genocide. Very little ink on the avoidance side coming out of the 2NR means to have a very low threshold to assuming that the affirmative access is some sort of external offense on switch side. There's no coherent TVA text extended in the 2NR. The only words they say are abolition, which isn't fundamentally distinct from an abolition policy app, which proves that either our affirmative provides a sufficient stasis, a ground that they would have gotten against an abolition app, or their interpretation doesn't provide any limits or consistent ground, because all of the things that are allowed under their interpretation are limited by the affirmative. But abolition doesn't solve quantum entanglements. It presumes a post-colonial world where the USFG can sort of move beyond violence that isn't rooted within indigenous imaginaries, which means we don't get to read our literature. The scapegoating dissad overwhelms it anyways. On switch side debate, there is no absolute separability between AF and neg. Their model denies the ways in which arguments on both sides are entangled and inform each other. If we could have read it on the neg, then the resistance but the AF and the one in the 1AC proves that you shouldn't believe them when they say that switch side debate or TVA results in better engagement with our criticism, because they circumvent those debates through AF framework or vacuous util good luck, which proves scapegoating. Don't let them access an idealized version of model of switch side. Assume the most likely to reversion of their debates, where critiques are pushed out on the neg as well. There's zero chance of self-reflexivity when policy teams get to read nuke terror impacts on the AF and neg, which proves our criticism of how the content of policy arguments are thoroughly entangled with the form of debate. The evidence they're citing is only operationalized if they win that policy teams are actually forced to switch reading different blocks, which doesn't happen under switch side debate, where both teams can still jump to nuke terror. I'll extend the counterinterpretation at the bottom, which is all the any residual offense you think is coming out of this 2NR. Affirmative should have to recognize their entanglement with the complicity of criminal justice violence. Yes, we know they're infinite affirmatives, but they're all tied back to the stasis point of criminal justice reform, which avoids all of their examples of arbitrary affirmatives and still provides coherent ground, which solves fairness and which solves any external benefits to fairness and clash. They conceded hedge crime, DLM, CAB, and abolition.
Debate.
Rahul, do you need a doc? Or are you good?
No, I think I'm good with what I got.
For sure.
Okay, yeah, I think I'm good. So let me know when everyone's ready.
I don't know.
Mitty, both of you here?
I need to call Luke. Maybe he's like, oh, there he is.
There he is. Okay. Everyone good? Okay, yeah, so this is a great debate. Really, definitely one of the best debates I've seen of the year. I voted neg for a model of topical debate that optimizes the balance of research between the AF and the neg. I think ultimately, I think that there's a very high risk that the AF does not solve a lot of the offense you're going for on T, which is kind of the starting point for the decision that I'm making, all the stuff that's happening on the case, because ultimately it is a filter or a mechanism by which you evaluate. Although there's a ton of offense on framework kind of scattered throughout, it's like what aspects of the offense, if any, does the AF actually solve? And I think the 2NR does a decent enough job saying that although maybe in the abstract fairness pales in comparison to like the full weight of like interventions or like, you know, turning into a prison plan or becoming Karl Rove, the question of the debate and of the ballot is ultimately what can the ballot remedy? Can the ballot solve, you know, voting AF solve these pieces of offense that you're going for? And so the first thing that obviously they go for in the 2NR is like the commodification stuff. And I'm not entirely sure that the 2AR is responding to the exact version of the argument they're going for. Like, I suppose like in an abstract sense, if commodification is already happening, there's no way to quantitatively discern whether the AF being commodified really matters. But the link argument is less about some like nebulous elites turning the AF into a PR campaign and more about a politics that participates in the otherization of culture that, you know, that they claim is wrongfully otherized. So like the further otherization or fetishization of the culture at hand. And obviously their evidence, like the Bell Hooks analysis in the 1NR that Alok's obviously extending, is like this marks a convergence between Western liberalism's kind of obsession with uncivilized culture and a self-proclaimed radical politics, which is essentially just a long-winded way of making a no solvency insolvency turn argument. The second thing on case, obviously this identity politics thing, yeah, it's irrelevant. You don't really need to go for this. And then the third sub point, which is like the allyship thing, I don't really think of that, or at least as presently constructed in the 2NR, that this is like some independent DA, more so of it is the impact argument to like sub point 1, which is like the notion of competition and the notion of using otherized cultures as a token in debate ultimately breeds a culture of false allyship. And so I think that put together, that kind of constructs a comprehensive argument that allows me to filter the kind of solvency component of the offense on framework. So going to T, the 2AR obviously begins with the like scapegoating DA, which as I understand it is essentially a DA to the next utopian conception of policy debate that everyone reads the TVA and everyone engages scholarship honestly, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm still not entirely sure why a combination of the TVA and switch side does not solve this in its entirety. I get that maybe the assumption that every debater who reads the plan would read the TVA is stupid and like, you know, is not realistic, but I'm not sure why the logical implication of that is that I should assume everyone reads the hedge good AF and only preps framework on the AF for the K, much like how if I were to assess the counter interpretation, I would not just say that because the negs limits offense that every K team would read Baudrillard, and there would not be some K teams who are equally invested in discussions of militancy and revolutionary strategizing, etc. So like it seems like the 2AR is trying to skew the burden of evaluation for how I should evaluate their interpretation versus how I should evaluate the counter interpretation. And I'm not entirely sure what the warrant for that skewed analysis would be. And so when it comes to like the impact of like the subjectivity stuff, the case arguments that I just explained make this like relatively clean. and is functionally in like an alt cause to why addressing, like, for example, the separability argument that you're making, right? Why solving that isn't sufficient to solve the prison planners or Karl Rove DA, because even if the counterinterpretation or the app somehow addresses this like separation thing between like what we do on the app and what we do on the negative, they're basically saying that whether or not you do that, there is this other link argument they're making to why you basically produce bad subjects and like, you know, subjects that are more invested in presenting themselves as they put it, woke, and less concerned with the like material ramifications of people who are kind of on the line on a daily basis. And so ultimately that would also produce bad subjects. So does the app solve subjectivity? I don't really think so. They have like a ton of ballot offense as well about like why individual ballots don't solve. And so if this is kind of the route you want to go, I think that's fine. I think the 2AR is very solid across the board on some of the issues, especially explaining like what the offense is. But I think the general big picture misstep of the 2AR is trying to emphasize the impact of all of your offense overwhelmingly, as opposed to winning the like solvency component of your offense, and maybe limiting the offense that you're going for and then accommodating the kind of solvency component of it. So I would have spent more time on case, not only just like dealing with what they have, but also reiterating the kind of nuance to your solvency explanation about why this like kind of generic bell hook stuff is just like not applicable, and why you have a pretty unique ballot argument. How does the ballot thing work? I'm not entirely sure that the Louisville example as kind of an argument in and of itself is a sufficient explanation for what the ballot would actually accomplish if I voted F. So yeah, I'll leave it there. See if you all have any questions.
I have a couple of that you doesn't have one right now. So first, in the 2NR, I felt like I was really spread thin because the 1AR just had a lot of ink on framework. So I wanted to know whether you had any tips on how I could better like identify the key differences between all of their different disheads. Because in an essence, I was sort of confused like as to whether I should like mold my explanation of the TVA to account for all of them, or whether they were each required like an independent response specifically. So just general thoughts about how the 2NR could have been more efficient on that.
Yeah. So I'm not okay. So in terms of just like offense, I think that there's like 3 DAs that are not entirely distinct from one another that are extended in the 1AR. So there's the avoidance DA, this like separation thing, and then this targeting thing. So like there's like 3 DAs that I can kind of like pick apart from the 1AR. I think ultimately the most effective way to deal with under-explained and underdeveloped DAs, but kind of the proliferation of those DAs in the 1AR, is to group DAs for which the premise or like the underlying warrant is consistent. So like, for example, let's say like the targeting DA is, yeah, so the targeting DA and the like separation DA, right? So like the premise of the separation thing is that settlers, when you think that like you can separate arguments and like you bounce back and forth and don't believe anything, that kind of ahistoricizes the like deliberative landscape, and as a result allows you to kind of like wallow in your own like settlerness. And you know, the targeting DA is like, well, the TVA can only think through settler colonialism at a kind of macro political level and can never think about micro political interactions. And so the singular premise underlying both of those is like, can the TVA account for both micro political and macro political you know, engagement with settler colonialism? And so I think that I'm not saying group the DAs and kind of answer them in like a, you know, in one fashion, but like identifying what the singular premises are that all these DAs share and answering those, I think is far more effective, just because all of these DAs can morph into anything in the 2AR. Basically, that is the strategy.
That was my fear. Yeah.
So the idea is, if you identify the thing that like the singular critique that underlies all of them, then there is no way for you to not be able to leverage that offense come the 2NR and for it to apply to whatever iteration of the offense they go for in the 2AR. So I think that a combination of what you're already doing plus the kind of thing that I just said, I think would set you up great for the 2NR and in the 2AR.
So just two more questions.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No. I was just thinking about the case as well. I'm not sure. I don't know. I mean, like I thought the 1NR on the bell hook stuff was great. Or it was as good as it needed to be, just given like it was not really answered, and given that the 1AR didn't answer it as well, I would have just framed it more concisely, because it felt like you're going for the same argument across 3 subpoints. Or at least like what is the impact of the commodification thing? If not, like it basically means that the analytic produced by the affirmative is one that is actually like not radical, but one that is like is exactly what you're describing with the false allyship thing, that the people that actually participated in it are like not really invested in helping people, but just more like the culture. And it's just like Burning Man 2.0 kind of thing. And so I think that the case could have been a lot more efficient when it comes to like time management.
Okay.
If you felt like it was all over the place.
Yeah.
But yeah, what are your questions?
The first one was going off of what you said about like, can the TVA account for both micro and micro level engagement? I tried to do that by saying that the TVAs would also allow like an advantage based on a personal narrative or like discussions of your own personal entanglement. But then like I felt like that kind of got watered down, because the AF's argument is true. Like not every AF would choose to do that. Is there a better way to answer that argument or prove that the TVA could be also a micro level analysis?
Yeah, I mean, I think it ultimately just like depends on what they mean by micropolitical, right? So if they mean micropolitical is literally what individual persons do, like in an everyday setting. So like, any performance of any individual in the area of criminal justice, then like there's a certain extent to which the TVA just cannot realistically deal with that. And so like that is not the portion of your defense that you want to apply to that portion of the offense. So I think that, but if it's like more so about say like micropolitical organization, like grassroots organizations, so like the way that a certain organization in Oakland organizes in a particular way to help indigenous communities that are wrongfully incarcerated, a lot of the way that we can have a discussion about topical action, the solvency advocate for those things do not need to be exclusive, need to forward a top-down focus, right? They can come from grassroots organizations. So I think like the very simple and like very cliche debate example is like the Black Panther Party had like a 10-point demand on the state. If we have a discussion about those demands, does that make them macro political? But if they're coming from like a more local organization, and so it's like the distinction between macro and micro is something that you maybe want to like just parse out a little bit earlier in the debate, and then so once you get to the place where you're explaining, well, micro involves organizations that also have demands on the state. And so the perspective of reform and criminal justice reform in particular need not be exclusively top down, which kind of obviates the majority of their like other like targeting DA, which is like you can only think of it from a top down perspective. It's like reform doesn't have to be that thing. But when it comes to like, it's only about how we interact with one another in debate in these deliberative spaces, then it's like if you make a performative argument on the negative, that would solve. And then the only thing you have to deal with at that point is just like the like separation thing, which the case would largely deal with, because all of your turns to their subjectivity argument essentially mean that they can't solve like the prison planner stuff.
Okay. And just last question, was there a way to prove to, I guess in your mind, that fairness as a terminal impact outweighs because of like a debate key or ballot key warrant?
I mean, so I think like, so there is a way, and I think that you got pretty damn close. I think that the reason why, if like without any of the stuff you're doing on case, it's hard for me. So like without some turns case argument or some like overwhelming set of defensive arguments that are convincing enough to suggest that the app, although maybe like persuasive when it comes to the impact turn, certainly cannot solve or certainly makes the situation worse when it comes to skills. without that, I think it's very difficult to persuade me that like fairness is like this intrinsic good above all. But I don't think it would make sense to do that, because part of the reason why fairness is an intrinsic good is that it's relevant and essential to anything that even a KF like counter interpretation would require, which is like some amount of deliberation, and in order to optimize that would require fairness. So like the clash or predictable limits or fairness turns the internal links of the AF component is like required in order to win that fairness is an intrinsic good. So I think that, I guess if that's what you're asking, and like it's like a combination of all those things, I think that's basically what you did. I think it could be the path of least resistance though to like do something else. It's just like we can also produce good things. Like the one in R is now like it's just like 3 to 4 minutes about here are all the ways that like policy debates produce like learning about particular things allow us to generate involvement in these kinds of grassroots organizations. This is what these grassroots organizations are doing now. They are involved in the state. They are involved in reform. So unless they have a particular gripe with all these things, then we solve as much, if not more, of the like kind of movement radical politics stuff. And it's just like either they have to impact turn the movements, which is like a very tough place for them. It's just it's hard for them to explain if you're like getting into the details of like this particular grassroots organization or nonprofit that's like involved in like prison abolition or prison reform or blah blah blah. It's like, what is the like persuasive impact turn given what they have, which is like all about time and less so about like a structural theory of ontology. And so I think that in this case they didn't have the like theoretical leverage to like win that, reform based or like grassroots movements would be bad.
Thank you.
Yeah.
What do you think is a better way to explain F solvency, like especially in the context of these 2 NR arguments?
The best way to explain F solvency.
Because I'm not sure whether to go like a very like subjectivity focused thing, or like that it's like a material survival strategy for like people in prisons. I'm just not really sure what to do with like the mechanism of this F, even though I like the impacts. I think they're cool.
Yeah. Well, I guess if you were to go down the like survival strategy route, I think a lot of things would have had to change, like even just like from 1AC, like the 1AC's construction, right? Because I think right now the 1AC is set up to just be like we are an epistemic break. And part of the difficulty with that is like, say, they had more of the movements oriented framework argument, so less the fairness stuff, more the like we have political movements on our side. They're like, we have this generative vision of what politics ought to look like. And so unless you have like a kind of a different explanation of what kinds of politics are produced by the epistemic break, that it's very difficult to like leverage any portion of your solvency or like make it seem like your solvency matters as much as theirs. And so in that case, if they were doing more of the movement stuff, I think like the survival strategy, the like how do you cope with the everyday, and like a focus on the quotidian and not the long term, right? That distinction would serve you well in that situation. But if they went more the like fairness route, which they did in this debate, I think the subjectivity stuff is fine. I think the issue for you was not like in this debate was not, is the subjectivity argument bad? It's just like you didn't win the like form of solvency argument that like ballots, just like the simple stuff. Do ballots solve or not? What is the reason why ballots would solve? What do we mean by subjectivity? Why are individual ballots key? Just like the simple frameworky form solvency arguments is just the stuff that tripped you up in this debate. But I don't think going forward that if you were debating a fairness framework argument that you need to change your story like drastically or whatever.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks.
Cool.
I have a quick question. In terms of handling like the thesis stuff about time, like the linear, non-linear time, like, do you think there was a way to handle that better? Like Alok and I haven't debated much of that before. So.
I mean, I think like as is the case with a lot of like K arguments, there are some things that are there for show, and then there are those that are like the impact of those arguments, right? So I think time itself is the show, and progress as linearity is the like impact, right? So like the colonial time thing is really just is the like cherry on top for like really what the primary argument is, which is that you should not think of progress or improvement according to a linear pathway, that our understanding of violence needs to be more comprehensive. And so instead of like kind of focusing on the garnishes, I think just identifying ultimately the like singular portion of offense that is essential to basically every thesis claim, which is like all the linear progress stuff, and also maybe some of this like everywhere all at once stuff that they're obviously applying to T and like your model of debate, where it's like the idea of separation between af and neg, what we do here, what we do there, this bad. And so those are really the only two arguments that after the 1AC, like even you seeing the 1AC, you can kind of identify what things are there in order for them to then apply to framework. So like the like linear stuff, it's like, okay, we shouldn't think linearly about what debaters should do. And like, you know, on also the, you know, we should think of violence not in this moment, but at all moments. Okay, so like the TBA couldn't solve that because the TBA has to be about the now. That's great. You have like the two things that they're going to do. So I'm going to talk about those two things and, you know, turn the crap out of them in the 1 and R. That's kind of like how I would just approach that.
That makes sense. Thank you. I don't have any more questions right now, but if I do, I'll definitely like email you.
Yeah, you all have my email, so feel free to hit me up whenever you need.
Yeah,
Thank
bye.
Cool. Yep. Good luck, everyone.
Thanks. Good luck.